Masechta Shabbos, Parak Chav Daled, Mishnah Aleph, the final parak. Misha hechshich baderech, noisen kisei lanochri, v'meini moinochri, menicha ala chamor. One who's on the road, as nighttime approaches on Friday, and realizes he'll not reach town before Shabbos begins, sounds like a story, so he may give his purse to a goy to carry it into town for him. Although one is generally osir midrabanan to instruct a goy to perform halacha on Shabbos, in this case, the Chachamim were mekel. The Chachamim did not want to rule that such a person must simply abandon his money on the road, because they understood that many people will not obey such a halacha. Those people would instead carry their purses themselves, being over an Isra Deraisa. If possible, he should hand the purse to a guy before Shabbos begins to avoid handling muktzah on Shabbos. However, if he was unable to do so, the Chacham allowed him to give it to the guy even after Shabbos begins. If there's no guy with him, he may place a purse on his donkey to carry it for him. Ordinarily, using an animal to carry an item through Rishus Rabbim on Shabbos is asur, because it's asur to do a malacha through an animal on Shabbos also. Do not do any malacha, you and also your animal. Therefore, it's forbidden on Shabbos to cause an animal that's carrying something to move either from a public to a private domain, or from Mimaiter and Shus or Shus, or Daladams for Shus or Rabbim. This is known as mechamer, which is leading a loaded animal. However, in this case, it's mutter as long as the traveler is careful to load and unload the animal while it's walking, so as to avoid any Isser Deraisa. We explained in Parak Aleph the Malach of Haitzah. There's Akira and Hanacha. Now, in between the Akira and Hanacha, there has to be some kind of carrying. Therefore, the traveler must place his purse on the donkey after it has already begun walking, so that the donkey doesn't put the purse into motion, which would be the Akira. Rather, the person does. Additionally, the traveler must remove his purse before the animal stops walking, so that the donkey doesn't make a Hanacha. In this case, the Akira and the Hanacha are done by the traveler, and the donkey only does the carrying. So he's doing a regular Akira and Hanacha, like he's picking up and putting something down in the same place, and the donkey is doing the Haitzah. Nevertheless, if there's a guy, it's preferable to give the purse to him, because instructing a guy to carry on Shabbos can never involve more than Isser Derabanan, whereas if you're placing the purse on the donkey, it could cause to an Isser Deraisa if the owner mistakenly loaded and unloaded the animal in the usual manner. When he reaches the outermost courtyard of the city and begins to unload his donkey, he may take off any utensils that may be normally be moved on Shabbos, items that are not muktzah. However, those utensils that may not be moved on Shabbos because they're muktzah, he may not be removed by hand. Instead, he unties the ropes that attach them to the saddle, and the sacks fall down on their own. Mishnah base. Generally, any malacha that requires significant effort is asur on Shabbos, even when no malacha is involved because of tircha. However, the Chacham allowed one to prepare food for his animals even if it involves significant tircha, and the Mishnah will discuss this. That was just interesting ha'ara. I don't know if it's right or wrong, but this is not the first or second time in the Masechta that we're discussing animal food on Shabbos. So why didn't the Mishnayos, I mean, it's not always the derech to do this, but it's like very much scattered around the Masechta. The Mishnah could have all lumped all the halachas together in a sense. So we may untie bundles of straw tied at both ends for the animal to eat. The straw in this case is tied with knots of a sort that may be untied on Shabbos. Since the animal cannot eat the straw while it's tied at both ends, it's mutter to untie the bundles on Shabbos in order to make them edible. By scattering the straw after untying it, said it will release an appetizing scent for the animal to smell is asur, since the animal will eat the straw even if this is not done. Since the animal can eat the straw without this improvement, the effort needed to scatter the straw is unnecessary and may not be done on Shabbos. Additionally, we may untie and even scatter soft cedar branches for an animal to eat, because the animals will not eat them unless they're scattered so they can smell them. Therefore, scattering them makes them edible and is mutter on Shabbos. Avalayas hazirin. However, we may not scatter triply bound bundles of straw tied at both ends and in the middle for an animal. Although when the straw is tied in three places and packed tightly together becomes unappetizing and the animal will not eat it, still, once it's untied, the animal will eat it, and it's not necessary to scatter the straw in order to spread it around so that the animal could smell it. Therefore, it's also to go about this effort of scattering it. One might have thought that triply bound straw, which warms and loses all scent because it's so tightly tied, must be untied and scattered to make it edible. The Mishnah therefore teaches like doubly bound straw, like the Mishnah's first case, untying it is good enough to render it edible, and scattering it is therefore going to be asur. One may not shred the animal fodder or the soft carrots for an animal because these items are tender enough to be edible without being shredded. Therefore, although shredding fodder and carobs, the charuvin, make them easier for the animal to eat, this preparation is asur on Shabbos because it involves unnecessary tircha. Bein bedaka, bein gasa. It makes no difference whether it's a small or a large animal. Livestock is divided into two general categories: large animals, which include cattle, horses, donkeys, and mules, and small animals, which is the dakim are sheep and goats. Either one is capable of eating this shachas and charuvin, even if they are not shredded. Therefore, regardless of the size of the animal, it's also to shred the animal food or the carobs for the animal to eat. Rabbi Yehuda matir b'charuvin ladaka. However, Rabbi Yehuda is matir shredding carobs for a small animal. The small animal's teeth are themselves small. Rabbi Yehuda holds that it's too difficult for an animal to chew through the charuvin unless they're for shredded, and shredding them thus makes it edible, which is permitted. Mishnah Gimel. Ein oivsin es hagamal v'loy darsin. One may not force feed a camel large amounts of food or even smaller amounts of food on Shabbos by pushing the food down the camel's throat far enough that it can no longer bring the food back up. Since this involves significant effort, it's asur on Shabbos. The word oivsin comes from avos, which is a trough. One may not stuff the camel with so much food that it creates a trough in its belly. Before setting out on a journey through the desert, it was customary for camel drivers to stuff their camels with enough food to last for several days, that there were few opportunities to obtain food for the camel in the desert. Avo malitin, however, he may put food down its throat to a point which the camel can bring it up, because this doesn't require such a significant effort. The ein mamrin es agolim avo malitin. One may not fatten calves by force feeding them, but one may put food down their throats up to the point to which they can still bring it back up. Mahalkitin l'tanagolim. One may also put food down the throats of chickens up to the point from which they can still bring it back up. Nice and maim lamorson. One may put water into bran for animals to eat. Avlek goivlin. One may not knead the bran with the water together. Merely adding water to the bran doesn't constitute kneading, which would be one of the 39 malachas. However, kneading the bran and the water together, stirring them, is forbidden, because this will be the malacha of kneading. Lush. One may not place water before bees that he's raising, or before doves in a dove cut to drink, because these creatures are capable of finding water on their own. Providing them with water on Shabbos is therefore asur. However, one may place water before geese, chickens, and Herodian pigeons, a kind of domestic dove named after Hordus, who raised doves of this type in his palace, so therefore they are called Hardisios Milashon Hordus, that he's raising, because these creatures are dependent upon him for their food and water, and are unable to find them on their own, so feeding them on Shabbos is going to be mutter. It's not going to be a problem of tircha on Shabbos. Mishnah Dalet. Machatchen es adlun lefnei behema, ves hanavela lefnei haklavim. In addition to the issue of how much one may exert himself in order to feed his animal on Shabbos, there's a question of whether certain foods may be fed to an animal of Shabbos if they weren't designated as animal food before Shabbos. As we will see, this question involves a far-reaching machlekes between Reb Shimon and Reb Yehuda that we can encounter several times throughout the Masechta, as to the extent of the Isra of Muktzah. Objects that are not prepared for use on Shabbos are Muktzah. This is a fundamental machlekes between Reb Yehuda and Reb Shimon about what's considered prepared for use on Shabbos. According to Reb Yehuda, any object that cannot be used for its normal purpose on Shabbos is Muktzah. Therefore, the owner doesn't expect to use the object, and it lacks preparation for Shabbos use, even though it could be used for some unusual purpose. Reb Shimon, on the other hand, holds that as long as the object can be used for some purpose on Shabbos, even if the purpose is not what the object is ordinarily used for, it's considered prepared for Shabbos use and is not muktzah. This is because Reb Shimon holds that an owner does intend to use an object for secondary purposes should the need arise. Specifically, the Mishnah will discuss the muktzah status of food items that are normally intended for human use, but which are not actually ready for such use when Shabbos began. If the foods were ready to be used before Shabbos began, then they're surely not muktzah. So Mechatkin es adlum lefnei behema, you may cut up raw gourds on Shabbos for an animal to eat. Gourds are too hard for animals to eat unless they're cut up into small pieces. The exertion involved in cutting them is therefore mutter, since it makes the food edible to the animals, as we explained in Mishnah Beis, that's what's going to make something mutter to do on Shabbos. Gourds are normally, because they are not muktzah, gourds are normally eaten by people rather than animals, and since they must be cooked in order to be eaten, raw gourds are not prepared for the normal use on Shabbos. Nevertheless, the raw gourds are not muktzah, because they can be eaten by animals, and are therefore considered prepared for this use on Shabbos, even though this is not the normal use. this is going to be going Lashitas Reb Shimon. This Tana is going to be going Lashitas Reb Shimon, who says an item is intended to be used even for uncommon purposes. Therefore, as long as the item is able to be used for some purpose, when Shabbos begins, it's prepared for use, and it's not muksa. We may also cut up an animal that died on Shabbos for dogs to eat. The carcass is too tough to be eaten by dogs unless it's cut up, and the tircha involved in this action is mutter, because it's not muksa. The normal use for a live animal is to be shechted and eaten by people. Since shechting is also on Shabbos, the animal was not prepared for its ordinary use when Shabbos began. In spite of this, the nevela is not muksa because the animal could die on Shabbos and thereby become usable as dog food. It is therefore considered prepared for this use even when it was alive at the beginning of Shabbos, which would also be going according to Reb Shimon. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees, and he says, if it wasn't already dead before Shabbos, you may not cut it up on Shabbos because it's not something that was prepared for the dog's use, and therefore muktzah. According to Rabbi Yehuda, an item is considered prepared only if it was fit to be used for its ordinary purpose when Shabbos began. The normal use of a living animal is to be slaughtered and eaten by people, not dogs. Since this animal was alive when Shabbos began, it cannot be shechted on Shabbos, is not considered prepared. Therefore, even when it dies on Shabbos and it's not for only for animals, it's not considered prepared and is going to be muktzah. Mishnah Hay, the final Mishnah in the Parak and the final Mishnah in the Masechta. Mefirin nedarim b'Shabbos. You may annul a vow. That is, a husband may be mefer his wife's neder, and a father may be mefer his daughter's neder on Shabbos. A man may be mefer his wife's or daughter's neder only on the day he hears of it. If a person makes a vow, a neder, he's mechuyev to keep it. However, a husband may be mefer the vow of his wife in certain situations. Similarly, a father may be mefer the neder of his daughter who has not yet reached gadlus, and they may do so, however, only on B'Yom Shammai, on the day that they first learned of this neder. So if he hears of the neder on Shabbos, he can be mevatel it on Shabbos, he can be mefer it on Shabbos, only on Shabbos itself, until Shabbos is over. Therefore, the Chachamim were matir being made for nedarim on Shabbos, since after Shabbos they can no longer be made for the nedarim. So being made for it on Shabbos is not considered any extra tircha. He may ask an expert or a bezdin of 3 hadyotis to release us from nedarim that were made to abstain from things that are necessary for Shabbos. For example, if someone made a neder not to eat on Shabbos, a person who makes a neder may seek release from his neder by appealing to a single expert, yochad mumcha, or a bezdin of shalosh hadyotis. The mumcha or the bezdin searches for a circumstance which had the vower, the person who made the neder, taken into consideration at the time of his neder, would have stopped him from making the neder in the first place. If they find such a circumstance, they may be matir the neder for him. Unlike being made for a neder, which must be performed on the day that the neder was first heard, asking for a heter from a neder has no time limit. One may therefore seek release from a neder on Shabbos only if it's necessary for the sake of Shabbos. Otherwise, it's usher because of unnecessary tircha on Shabbos, meaning getting together the bezdin or going to the yochad mumcha and trying to figure it out can end up being a big tircha. Parkikin es hamor. You may temporarily shutter a window on Shabbos with the board that's not attached to it. Since the board is being added only temporarily to the structure, it does not appear like the malacha of boina. As we discussed in Parak Yozayin, there's machlekes Reb Eliezer and the Chachamim regarding this case. Reb Eliezer says that inserting the shutter appears to be adding to the binyan. Therefore, he says that it's also mishum boina. However, the Chachamim were matter since it's only a temporary addition to the structure. Placing it in the wall, in the window, does not resemble building. Our Mishnah rules in accordance with the Chachamim, and therefore matir is matir one to temporarily shutter a window on Shabbos with an unattached board. You may measure a rag to determine whether it's large enough to transmit tumah. The halacha is that a cloth of wool or linen can neither become tummy nor transmit tumah unless it measures at least 3 by 3 etzbois. The minimum size necessary to be halachically considered as a beged. In this case, a shmata of more than 3 by 3 finger breadths becomes tummy. It's then reduced in size, and then after it became smaller, it came in contact with food that must be kept tohar. So the shmata, the matlas, must therefore be measured to determine whether it still measures 3 by 3. In which case, it transmitted tumah to the taurus, or whether its reduction left it with less than the measurements. Bes ha-mikvah. You may also measure a mikvah to determine whether it's large enough to be a kosher mikvah. It needs to be at least 40 saw. Although usually the act of measuring is also b'darabanan on Shabbos because it's a uvda d'chol, the Chachamim allowed it for the purpose of a mitzvah. Since the measurements sizing up the shear for these cases are needed to determine the halachic status of the matlas and or the mikvah, they're considered measurements of a mitzvah. There was a story in the days of Reb Tzadok's father and Abba Shol ben Batnas. There were two houses with a narrow alley between them. Their two roofs were connected by a barrel that reached over the alley from one house to the other. In one of these houses, a man lay dying. As a result, the residents of the second house were worried that when he died, the tumah would spread through the window of his house into the alley, and from there through a window into their house. An oil that shelters both a dead body and a person or utensil spreads the dead body's tumah to the person or utensil. The tumah is not confined to the room which the mace is found, but can travel to adjoining rooms through the openings or windows in the walls, as long as the other room also has a roof. Therefore, when the man in the first house dies, the mace will spread tumah through the window of his house into the alley, since the barrel suspended over the alley acts as a roof. Additionally, since the barrel connects the two roofs, the tumah will then spread from the alley through an open window into the second house and be metame the second house also. To prevent tumah from entering to the second house, its residents shuttered the window in their house that faced the alley with an earthenware container. An object that is immune to tumah can block it from traveling through an opening. Therefore, they used an earthenware container and faced the bottom of the container towards the alley. The container was thus able to stop the tumah from spreading into the second house, since the outside of an earthenware container is unaffected by tumah. Because the klicheres can only become tameh, is only metame mitochai and not from the outside. However, this might not have been necessary because the barrel that connected the two roofs had a gap of unknown size in it. If it was larger than a tevach, then the tumah would be unable to travel past that gap. Tumah is able to travel only as far as the roof continues without any holes the size of a tefach or larger. If there was a space of at least a tefach wide separating one part of the roof from the other, then the tumah can spread only until that hole. Therefore, after plugging the window, the residents attempted to check the size of the hole to see if they could safely remove the earthenware keli from the window without making it become tameh. So they measured an earthenware vessel to see its width was exactly a tefach wide, and after doing so, they tied it to a stick with a strand of reed grass. They used reed grass for the following reason: since it can be fed to animals, one who uses this grass for tying intends for it to remain tied only briefly. The knot is therefore not permanent and may be tied on Shabbos or Yontif. This would determine whether or not the gap in the barrel that was overhanging the alley was a tefach wide. With this story, we learned three halachas. We learned that one may temporarily shutter a window, as they did with the earthenware container in the window of the second house. The earthenware container was used to shutter the window only as long as it was needed to block the tumah. Since it was only temporary, it was mutter. One may measure to determine the halachic status or to perform some other type of mitzvah, as they did with the tefach wide keli. And number three, kaishrin, one may tie a temporary knot, as they did with the reed grass. Hadron Lach Masechta Shabbos, beautiful 24 prakim. The minhag was by many places that they would divide Masechta Shabbos into three parts, and by each Suda they would learn another part of the Masechta. But I think I just want to end off with one quick thing: that Kaitrin, the last two words of the Masechta, are Kaitrin b'Shabbos. The avoda to take with us is that when you leave such a big and beautiful Masechta that's so negeya, so many halachas, so many important halachas, Kaishrun l'Shabbos, our bakasha is that we should be able to be tied to Shabbos. We should be able to have a kesher and a connection to Shabbos. And the Chavetz Chaim in the beginning of Mishnah Berurah Chil Gimel writes b'Shem Rabbi Shneibshitz in the Aros Dvash that a person who doesn't learn the Hilchos Shabbos, doesn't know Hilchos Shabbos, chances are he's going to be Mechal Shabbos. So, in order to not be Mechal Shabbos, I'd feel that we should be able to, same way we're able to learn the halachas, we should be able to keep the halachas also. Hadron Lach Masechta Shabbos, sei gesund.